talk about Doom on the Game Boy Advance, and very quickly the conversation will drift to the original Doom. And as it should. When Doom first arrived on the GBA in October 2001, it was seen as a massive achievement. The Doom experience squeezed down to fit in your pocket. It wasn't just a technical marvel, it was proof that id Software's juggernaut franchise could go to places few ever thought it was possible. And sure, it wasn't the full PC game, but that didn't really matter to gamers who were eager to get their Doom fix on the go. Yet the franchise wasn't done with Nintendo's handheld after that one game. Just over a year later, GBA owners were offered a follow-up that was even more ambitious, a port that didn't just settle for some Doom, it brought over the entirety of Doom 2. For context, Doom 2 launched in late 1994 and was seen as something of a more demanding title. It was bigger, more complex, and heavier on system resources. Bringing it to home consoles had proven difficult. The game only saw serious attempts at releasing on consoles in the 90s through the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Even these ports came with compromises and their own performance issues. So the idea of cramming the full Doom 2 experience onto a handheld console, which was barely able to handle the original Doom, seemed like the stuff of fantasy. Enter Taurus Games, an Australian studio tasked with the impossible: bring Doom 2 to Nintendo's handheld console. Using the custom-built Southpaw engine, Taurus set about bringing Doom 2 to the Game Boy Advance. That meant serious sacrifices. Texture quality was stripped back, lighting effects were scrapped completely. The resulting game had a flat, oddly surreal aesthetic, one that at times didn't really resemble Doom 2 at all, but still managed to feel like Doom. What they created is arguably one of the most ambitious titles ever released on GBA. Doom 2, nearly in its entirety in the palm of your hand. At a time when home console owners couldn't even play Doom 2 in its entirety, Taurus Games delivered the entire package. But make no mistake about it, it isn't a perfect port. Even at the time, reviewers noted a number of nagging issues. Performance was all over the place, while visuals came across washed out and hard to comprehend at times. The removal of multiplayer left some disappointed. Doom 1 on GBA delivered a solid deathmatch experience. Plus, it needs to be stated that where the first Doom on GBA had novelty on its side, Doom 2 didn't benefit from that same honeymoon period. Enthusiasm was more muted. For some players, it felt like a sequel that had arrived too quietly, too flawed, and didn't impress in the same way as the first game, and thus was ignored by and large by Nintendo gamers. And I think that's a genuine shame. Because what is here is surprisingly complete. All 32 levels make the cut, even some of the more sprawling levels like Map 15 Industrial Zone and Map 24 The Chasm. Those two levels in particular are split into separate smaller levels due to the hardware limitations, and I'd argue that in the Chasm's case, it actually improves the experience greatly. That level has always been divisive with Doom players, but when split in two, it feels tighter and more coherent. It makes better use of the space in a way that the original incarnation simply didn't. Other levels are altered in subtle but smart ways. Take the courtyard. On PC, it's a big open space with a ton of enemies that flood in, a nightmare for the handheld console to render. On GBA, the level adds large dividing walls to limit draw distance. Rather than ruin the atmosphere, it gives the level a more claustrophobic, maze-like tension that fits the Game Boy Advance format surprisingly well. This kind of thoughtfulness is seen throughout the port. The Crusher, Bowels of Fun, Monster Condor. Geometry is simplified, yes, but never lazily. Every change is made with the intention to keep the gameplay flowing with respect to the hardware's limitations, but not compromising too much. And impressively, all the enemies from Doom 2 make the leap, including the Archvile. That one's a particularly big deal because the PlayStation and Sega Saturn versions of Doom 2 left them out completely. That also means that the Icon of Sin survives the transition, still serving as the final boss, something that I hate but I've come to appreciate. In terms of content, it's hard to fault this port. All the levels, all the monsters, all the weapons, it's all here, and on a handheld. Even the controls, limited as they are, work surprisingly well. The GBA has just 4 primary buttons to work with, A, B and the 2 shoulder buttons, but Taurus managed to make the scheme intuitive. Sure, an extra button or two would have really helped out here, but what's here is functional. It's kind of a miracle they make it feel this close to the PC Doom under the circumstances. But let's be fair, the flaws with this port are noticeable. The graphics are easily the most criticised element. The GBA's 240 by 160 resolution simply can't show the detail needed for fast-paced action. Distant enemies become pixel blobs, and without any lighting effects, everything has this flat, washed-out look. There's no way around it, it's ugly. Functional, but ugly. This is made worse when you remember that the original GBA console didn't have a backlight, meaning that it made things harder to see. The Game Boy Advance SP makes things a bit better, but it also gives the levels a blown out visual appearance, which undermines some of the darker and more surreal elements of the world. Enemy visibility is also a real problem. Sometimes foes don't even appear until they're practically on top of you. The game helps you here by sleeping enemies who are at a distance, effectively freezing them until you get close, but it's not an elegant solution. It makes some encounters feel incredibly awkward as the enemies don't move or react to what you're doing, instead waiting for you to run right up to them or just shoot them till they're dead. And then there's the infamous armor bug, a strange quirk that means if you finish a level with armor, it doesn't actually apply in the next level until you pick up an armor item. The game will say you have armor equipped, but functionally you're unprotected. It's a subtle but frustrating glitch that can make certain levels far more difficult than intended. Performance-wise, the small levels are fine, but when the game opens up, as it inevitably does, the frame rate suffers. Larger maps cause noticeable slowdown, and during intense fights, it does absolutely tank the frame rate. These are the moments that remind you you're playing on an underpowered console, no matter how ambitious the vision was for this game. I would also add that the sounds in this version are very hit and miss. Some of them are fine, and the music in the game isn't outright terrible, but at the same time it all sounds a bit weird, and it's very hard to put your finger on why. And yet, in 2002, none of this mattered to me. We didn't have a family PC back then, so my options to play Doom were limited. When I bought a GBA SP, Doom 2 was the very first game I hunted down. Here was Doom 2, my favourite game of all time, in an almost complete package running on a machine that could fit in my coat pocket. I took it to high school, I played it at friends' houses. It was my way to play Doom, and for that purpose alone it worked. It wouldn't be until the Nintendo Switch, nearly 15 years later, that we'd see another handheld version of Doom 2 arrive on the Nintendo console. That's pretty amazing to think about. But for the time of its release, the GBA port was astonishing. Looking back now, is it the best way to experience Doom 2? Absolutely not. But that's not really the point here. What matters is that they did it. Taurus Games took on an impossible task and delivered something that shouldn't have worked, but it absolutely does, in its own flawed and fascinating way. Doom 2 on the Game Boy Advance may not be perfect, but it's proof of how far passion and ingenuity can push hardware limits. To a whole generation of Nintendo gamers, this was the way that they experienced the world of Doom for the first time, and even now, I still get stupidly nostalgic for those crunchy graphics and awkward sounds. Flawed? Absolutely, but still hugely impressive for the package that was offered up here. So what I wanted to do here very quickly was just show off a quick cross-section of some of the levels from Game Boy Advance Doom 2, because I think it's important for people to experience what it's like to actually play through this. And you can see up front, this is a very, very bright version of Doom 2 here. As I mentioned earlier on in the video, this version really does away with sort of different lighting levels. A lot of this is just lit up in the sort of same level, and rooms kind of just blend into one big sort of homogeneous mess. But the thing is, you can clearly see that the enemies are here, they're reacting as we would like them to. Obviously this isn't running on the Doom 2 engine, but we're able to move around, and the levels are here in their full forms, and I think that's really, really cool. Now obviously you can see the texture quality is very hit and miss. The thing is, you have to remember though, we are blowing this up to HD quality, and obviously if you're playing this on your Game Boy Advance screen, it's not going to be as noticeable. Now we're going to jump into the 15th level here, which is Industrial Zone. So this is one of those levels that's been cut in half, and when I say it's been cut in half, I physically mean they put a wall like halfway through this level and you can't access the second half of it. You can kind of see that they've changed the wall over there, so there's no sort of ledge on the other side. Basically there is a new exit to this level, and then you get taken to the second part of the level when you complete this first part. One of the more weirder quirks of Doom 2 on the Game Boy Advance is that if you choose to play on any of the free easier difficulty settings, then you actually get slightly higher texture quality, but if you play on the Nightmare difficulty, which replaces Ultraviolence, don't ask me why that is, then you actually get a slightly reduced texture quality, which I find fascinating because obviously that's been done to help with performance, with more enemies and more things going on. But you can kind of see as we're exploring around here, and yes, I am playing on the Nightmare / Ultraviolence difficulty here. Performance is okay in this space. It's not great, but it's definitely playable, and I think that's the main thing. even at its absolute worst, Game Boy Advance Doom 2 is playable, but I don't think for a lot of people who are used to modern Doom source ports, I don't think they're going to find it fun coming back to experience this very variable frame rate here. I think Downtown is a good level to show off here because there's such a wide variety of textures used in this level, and you'll see kind of how just low quality things can get in the distance. If you look at the textures in the distance over there, just how they just lack detail and how enemies just kind of disappear. You can see how that bony boy there has not woken up even though we're shooting. As I mentioned in the video earlier on, the game kind of puts enemies to sleep, and the reason it does that is so that there's not so much going on, because obviously the Game Boy Advance really struggles with lots of enemies doing lots of things. And you can see these alleyways are lit up so brightly here. It's definitely not like this on the PC version. And you can see here the frame rate is not doing that well, because we've got a lot of enemies here. And most of these enemies, when we kind of move out a certain distance, it's not a big distance by the way, they do just kind of stop and they kind of wait for you to come back into their orbit. But like I said, it's just, some of these levels don't look great in this version, and I think that it's impressive this is even here, because this level didn't even get on the PlayStation 1 version of Doom 2. But at the same time, you have to question the decisions that were being made to bring all the levels over. We'll dive into some Monster Condor here. Now, the thing with this level is there's a lot of enemies, and you can kind of see, just looking around, this level is definitely not designed to be lit up like this. And again, I think this is one of the aesthetic things about this version that really helps it to stand out, both in good and bad ways, because obviously this was designed for the Game Boy Advance without the backlight. So, and you can see that, you know, they're trying to help people out, I guess. I can assume that was the logic behind it, but for me, I don't really like how washed out some of these rooms end up looking. Well, I cannot get over that. Again, the controls in this version are a bit hit and miss, and it's one of those things where the console itself just doesn't have the number of buttons I think Doom requires in order for it to work properly. But this is actually a really fun moment to show you how this works, because we can shoot the bony boys from all the way across this long room and they will not react to us. They will not turn to fight us. They will not run down here to attack us, because the game basically puts enemies to sleep once you're a certain amount of space away from them. And in situations like this, it's really helpful, because bony boys in the Game Boy Advance version are my absolute bane of existence. They can absolutely destroy you in seconds because of that armor glitch. But you can see, even though we're running towards them here, the bony boys have not woken up until we get right up to them. Oh, you can see how much damage that did as well. That was nasty. You can even see that bony boy there was still asleep until we were right next to them. But yeah, we'll dive into the final, well, penultimate level here, which is the Living End. And the thing is, the Living End is probably the biggest test of how this performs. And you can see it's not doing okay. I think it's doing about okay here. When you look out on all of this, it lacks any real kind of detail. All of the textures just look like they are flat colors, which is really, really funny to see. But, you know, again, really ambitious port here. I can't really hate it, because what else could you expect on the Game Boy Advance? Obviously, GBA Doom, the fan-made port, I would need to play through that to this level to see the comparison, but it would be interesting to see if you could squeeze a bit more performance out of this. The Pain Elemental there looks rough in this version, by the way. It just looks particularly rough when you kind of get up close to it there. But you can kind of see this is Doom, and it plays like Doom, and that's really the main thing here. I think that you have to take the visuals with a pinch of salt. This was 2002. Standards were very different back then, in particular with handheld gaming. Doom hadn't made a handheld appearance on consoles up to this point, and honestly, I think this is just really impressive. This was the main way I played Doom for a good year or two before I was able to buy a laptop for myself. So for me, this is all just very nostalgic, and it's such a miracle port. But let me know what you think of Doom 2 on the Game Boy Advance.